Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this celebration of the 125th anniversary of Humanist UK. My name's Andrew Copson. I'm the Chief Executive of Humanist UK. And as we know, of course, the ideas of humanism and the humanist approach to life, the ideas that bring us all together this evening, are as old as the written records of human beings' thoughts themselves. We find our ideas that we today call humanism all around the world, in China, right back into ancient times, in classical India, and of course in the ancient Mediterranean world. But tonight we're celebrating a much more specific and time-bound anniversary, which is the anniversary of our organisation. And although humanist ideas are very old, humanist organisations are much younger. Today we are a mere 125 years old, and that's what we're going to be celebrating this evening. So over the next 12 months or so, we'll be doing a lot of things to mark the anniversary of our organisation, look back and uncover some of the history that has been forgotten, as well as reflecting on how present trends and also future possible events might be influenced by our past and the messages from the past that our founders and humanist activists of the 20th century might have for us as we contemplate the future. But we've also at Humanist UK invested in a very specific project around this, our anniversary year, which is a project called Humanist Heritage. And some of you may have already seen the website of resources. We're going to hear more about it later today. And that's really the main way in which we're celebrating our 125th anniversary. That's what this evening is mostly going to be about, therefore. The uncovered history of our organisation, its achievements over the last 125 years. And we'll be hearing from all sorts of people this evening who've either studied or in one or two cases played their direct part in the events of humanist history. First of all, though, we're very pleased on this day, which is our literal birthday. It was on this day in 1896 that the first board members came together to form what became Humanist UK. We're very pleased on this day to have some special videos from people who wanted to wish us happy birthday. Ever since our beginning as an organisation, we've existed not just for the support and fortitude of our members, building up our own approach to the world, but we've been outward looking. We've sought legal, social, political change in society to make a better world, to make a better life for everybody. And we're very pleased that today that political commitment, small p political commitment of the humanist movement is reflected by birthday wishes we've received from across the political spectrum in the UK.
I'm delighted to congratulate Humanist UK on your 125th anniversary. Ever since its foundation as an ethical movement, humanists have contributed enormously to our party's and to our nation's achievements. Labour's first Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, was an early president of Humanists UK. And so was Nye Bevan, the founder of our NHS, Jenny Lee, who created the Open University, and Dora Russell, a campaigner for abortion law reform. Humanists and Humanist UK have been at the forefront of the fights for social change, to decriminalise homosexuality, to end corporal punishment in schools, and to introduce free school meals. But you've also played an integral role in our communities, from setting up humanist housing associations and adoption agencies, through to today's very popular humanist ceremonies. When a small group of radicals met 125 years ago, they could scarcely have imagined the impact that they would have on our shared values, on our laws, and on social progress. Thank you to Humanists and Humanist UK for all you've contributed to our society. Here's to the next 125 years.
I'd like to wish Humanists UK a very happy 125th anniversary and show my appreciation for the enormous contribution that humanists make to our society. 125 years ago, a small band of humanists in each of the 4 nations of the UK came together to create this movement, and 125 years later you are still going strong. In Scotland, that is embodied by the Humanist Society Scotland, who do so much good work, from providing pastoral care in hospitals and universities to initiatives like street care, delivering food in communities across Edinburgh, Glasgow and Stirling. So on this 125th anniversary, I want to thank you for all that you do and wish you a very happy occasion and many more years.
For the 125th anniversary of Humanists UK, I want to wish a very happy birthday to the organisation and hope it is a year of celebration for you and all you've achieved. When I heard about your anniversary, it got me thinking a lot about the role that many humanists have played in my life and the role humanism must play in the lives of some of my humanist colleagues and friends. The party I lead unites a number of traditions. Liberal Democrats have always been a place where reformers of all types have come together to take the best of their different traditions and ways of thinking in pursuit of our common liberal goals. I'm a Christian, and many of my values come from Christian teachings, but I recognise that for many people, religion isn't where their main values come from. It's not what motivates them to get up and go to work, or to care for their relatives, or to give their time to charity and the needy. Many people in this country don't have religious beliefs, but live by a basic, almost intuitive ethic of compassion, of rational thinking and of kindness, which is what humanists mean by humanism. And I want to recognise all that humanists have done over these past 125 years to benefit our society and in the party I am proud to lead. A good example is Willie Goodhart, a very committed humanist who first wrote the Liberal Democrat Constitution. And I actually know the same goes both ways. Humanists UK's first chair was Elizabeth Swan, a Liberal campaigner who successfully campaigned to embed midwifery in our national healthcare. Elizabeth is one of many Liberals and humanists whose untold stories were recently unearthed in the run-up to this anniversary. I'm fascinated to learn that the history of humanism is now being taken out of the archives and put onto the web. There's a lot to explore. Liberal and humanist traditions have long been intertwined. Many liberal humanists shape the society we live in. I think of philosophers like John Stuart Mill, liberal suffragists like Emily Hobhouse, and in the 20th century figures like William Beveridge, the father of our welfare state, and the liberal economist John Maynard Keynes. I'm proud that in 125 years, my party has been good to humanists, giving them the same respect and recognition as people with a religious faith. In Scotland, Liberal Democrats in government back in 2005 helped oversee the legal recognition of humanist marriages. Since then, the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Channel Islands have followed suit, and today there are more humanist marriages in Scotland than any other kind. At the last general election, Liberal Democrats stood on a manifesto which called for humanist marriages to be recognised in England and Wales too, and we stand by that, because marriage is a fundamental right. As humanists and as liberals, we want many of the same things. We all want to see a tolerant and inclusive society where decisions are made on the basis of the best available evidence and built on a foundation of human rights, democratic values, and the rule of law. So on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, I'd like to wish a very happy birthday to Humanists UK.
Hello, I'm Sian Berry, co-leader of the Green Party, and I'm wishing a very happy 125th birthday to Humanists UK. As a humanist myself, I often feel like my humanist values and green values spring from the same place, because to me, humanism is about recognising that we came from the living world and we live within it. And our concern for other living beings, for our planet and for our future generations is core to both of these philosophies. It's an approach to life shaped by a rational, evidence-based understanding of our society and the problems we face, not only as individuals, but collectively. These are values which are so important to humanists and Greens alike. And there's a lot to be gained from knowing you're part of a long history full of inspiring stories. It can be a source of encouragement and of courage, because sometimes acting on our convictions means having to find the courage to speak up, even when others find what you have to say inconvenient. In the long history of Humanists UK, that's what many women's rights campaigners, race equality activists, pioneers of LGBTIQA+ rights, climate activists, and more all had to do. Speaking out inconveniently, sometimes decades and decades before these issues became mainstream, and they started to change our society for the better. We're grateful that they did. It's a story that should inspire all of us who dream of a better world. One simple humanist conviction that inspires me, something which is evident all around me, is this. For the most part, people are good and they want to do good. I see that across all communities. I've found it to be true in every part of the country and every part of society. And it's equally true of humanists and people with religious beliefs. This year, we commemorate that 125 years ago, a group of activist men and women met up and put forward a positive vision of the world, with ideas like universal education, votes for women, non-discrimination in the workplace, rights for gay people, inclusive schools. Today, millions attend humanist ceremonies or are touched by the work of humanist pastoral carers in hospitals or participate in humanist campaigns for free thinking and freedom of choice. And many more share these values, quietly, sometimes unnamed, doing their part for a kinder, more sustainable society. Now, I've read a bit of the new Humanist Heritage website, and I look forward to reading much, much more about the men and women who make its fascinating story. I wish a very, very happy anniversary to Humanists UK and all who share her values.
And I said that we have congratulations from across the political spectrum, and indeed we do, because I'm happy to be able to also read out a letter today from Lord Greenhall, who is the Minister of State at the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government from the Conservative Party, obviously, who is the Minister who is responsible for government relations with humanists. He says, I'm delighted to be sending you this message to join your celebrations to mark the 125th anniversary of Humanists UK. It's so important that on a special anniversary, you reflect on all that humanists in the UK have achieved over the past 125 years. As well as celebrating your broad contribution, we can renew our celebrations of individual humanists working in various fields, such as the sciences, philosophy, defence and the arts, who've truly reflected humanist values, to think independently and act with kindness and tolerance for the benefit of our shared society. It is good to see the work of humanists featured within your new Humanist Heritage project and website. As we prepare, he goes on, for our national recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, I would like to thank humanists in the UK for their tireless contribution to the national effort. You've all contributed in numerous ways, with many humanists working in frontline services or the NHS, some of you engaging with government on critical issues, but very significantly, you've supported bereaved families and provided space for people to mourn and remember. I hope that you are able to come together in person over the coming months for some of your events to celebrate your 125th anniversary. Well, as I say, the humanist movement, both in the UK and other countries, has always been one that, as well as focusing on ourselves, internally building up each other in beliefs and values and reaching out to humanists to increase their own fortitude in their beliefs and convictions, has been outward facing. And it's been great to have so many reflections and recognitions of that from across the political spectrum in the UK. I turn now to the big project that some of those political leaders we've just heard from have been reading about and engaging with themselves, which is the Humanist Heritage Project. And I'm delighted now to be able to introduce Madeline Goodall, Maddie, who is going to tell us a little bit more about it. We were incredibly lucky to find her just over a year ago to be the manager of this project. She has been elbow deep in our archives and in all sorts of other libraries and archives across her time with us. I remember when all of the Humanist UK archives were housed in rather damp cardboard boxes under Gower Street. And it was a considerable joy for me to be able to pass them over to where they are now at the Bishopsgate Institute in London, to have them properly catalogued, properly respected, properly filed. And I think that really they were waiting all that time just for Maddie to come along and treat them as well as she has and showcase them for all of us. So we'll now hear from her, yes, there she is, about the work that she's been doing in uncovering this rich history of ours.
Hi everyone, I am Maddie. I'm the Humanist Heritage Coordinator. as Andrew says, I have at points been elbow deep in the archives, although, as you would imagine, it's been a few months now since I've been able to be there in person. But nevertheless, thanks to the glorious collection at the Bishopsgate and the brilliant staff there as well, I have been able to get lots of research done, and I'm going to share a presentation which I hope will give an idea of some of that research. I'm going to base this around a series of quotes that give a sense of the history that we're talking about and the real length of the history of humanist thought, not just in the last 125 years, but in those years that led up to it, and often directly exchanged people and ideas with the ethical movement itself when it arose. I've started with this Frances Wright quote, an amazing woman, feminist, abolitionist, activist, set up an experimental community in the States on the basis of Robert Owen's philanthropic utopian socialist principles. And as she says in this quote, she devoted her life to laying the foundation of a society where affection, kind feelings, and respect for the liberties of others were the basis of the world. And that indeed is a very humanist sentiment. As I say, this is an incredibly long history, which encompasses, of course, the tendency to humanist thought even before it takes that name. It's a tendency to thinking for oneself, towards free thought, a faith in the scientific method, a trust in the individual conscience, and the impulse to activism, which kind of naturally arises from all of those things. And we can see that all the way through the history, not just of the organisation, but as I say, all of the individuals who came before, including Frances Wright, accepting that this life is the only one we have, and it is our duty, our responsibility to improve it for ourselves and for others. The beginning of the ethical movement itself in America with Felix Adler, the son of a rabbi, was fundamentally about not by the creed, but by the deed. It was about doing good works, and it was a unifying desire for social improvement, exemplified by Felix Adler himself, who did huge amounts of work with the poor in New York, for the abolition of child labour, anti-imperialist, all sorts of charitable causes. And that really set the foundation of what became the ethical movement and the organised humanist movement in the UK. It's important to note that the Humanist Heritage Project hasn't been about kind of dancing back through history and slapping a humanist label on people that we find. What it is about is recognising that they have always existed, and that they've been doing amazing things all the way through these years, based essentially on this concept of working not by the creed, but by the deed. The focus of much of the research for the Humanist Heritage Project has naturally been from the 1800s onwards. The ethical societies in the UK emerged in the 1890s, or the 1880s, in fact, for the earliest ones, and the Union, as has been mentioned, came in 1896. So this takes us from the influence of the Enlightenment and the values of the Enlightenment through things like Owenite rational religion, and the secularism that was part of that and arose from it as well, in the ideas of Robert Owen and his followers, including Frances Wright. Then, of course, radical secularism, and the great changes and efforts towards freedom of expression, freedom of the press, through that. And then we see the positivist secular religion of humanity, inspired by the ideas of Auguste Comte. And this quote I've chosen here from Harriet Martineau, herself a brilliant freethinker, expresses her idea for what positivist philosophy, a secular, essentially humanist philosophy, could give to us. The ethical societies themselves arose, as I say, in the 1880s, in a time when the Victorians still really considered Christianity and morality to be synonymous. And so the ethical societies consciously, I would argue, in their name and in everything that they did, wanted to emphasize that it was not just by virtue of Christianity or theological ideas that you could do good things. And in this sense, it was a very empowering movement from its earliest stages, not least for women who were often bearing the brunt of expectations arising from Christian concepts of morality. Zona valence, as it turns out, and this was not previously known, but had been discovered in the archives, was essentially Andrew's first Humanist UK ancestor. She was the chief executive, the first chief executive of Humanist UK when it became the Union of Ethical Societies in 1896. She was a fascinating woman, tragically died at just 44, but up until then had been writing and lecturing widely in the cause of humanist values and for feminism and socialism too. Zona Valance, as you can see from this quote, very much believed that with one life and the one life that we have, it is our responsibility to explore what is possible and what can change. And this very much arose from this new understanding of the world and of the history of the world that science and publications like Darwin's On the Origin of Species had given to us and given to women in particular. Suddenly those accepted hierarchies of sex relations could be thrown out and society could be transformed. People like Zona very much took that on. And John Stuart Mackenzie, who was one of the earliest of the Ethical Society members, a very active part of the London Ethical Society, which was the first in the UK, founded in 1886. He himself was a philosopher. And as you can see from, again, this quote, this exciting and empowering sense of new knowledge and new understandings, not being terrifying or dazzling in a dangerous way, but rather empowering and exciting us to live in the open sunshine and to act accordingly. There isn't actually a picture of John Stuart Mackenzie that I could find, but there is one of Millicent Mackenzie, his wife, the first female professor in Wales, and also a very active member of the ethical movement. Both of them championed moral education rather than theological education in schools, which was from the very earliest days of the ethical movement central to their activism and their concerns, just as it remains today in Humanists UK's campaigning policies. As I say, this new understanding of ourselves, of the world, of history, of science, was empowering. Empowering as a tool for understanding, but also as a tool for acting. And as such, early members of the ethical societies were incredibly involved in efforts for suffrage, for penal reform, for healthcare reform, reproductive rights, civil rights, against censorship, against blasphemy laws, for divorce law reform, for marriage reform, in education, as school founders, as activists for secular education, and as teachers. And all of this was about bringing rational, compassionate attitudes to bear on social reform. Alice Woods, a member of the Hampstead Ethical Institute this time, which became the Hampstead Humanist Society, and one of the longest continually running societies. She was a pioneering school teacher and headmistress, and particularly advocated for co-education. But she very much believed that we should learn from the past in order to let the next generation take over, to think freely, to make decisions for themselves and to act on those decisions. And this was in the wake of things like the First World War, which had, of course, profoundly changed the way that the world, society, and individuals were understanding everything. As has been mentioned, the kind of crowning achievement, I hope, of this project is the Humanist Heritage website. I am at pains to emphasise that this will be an ever-growing resource. Nobody is more aware than I am of how many people we can include on this. As I say, lots of my research is particularly focused on unearthing some of those hidden stories of activists in the early ethical movement in particular, who brought profound change to the country, and who have been largely forgotten in history, including lots of women, both forgotten in the history of humanism and free thought, but also in broader histories of social change. And so, as I say, this will be a perpetually unfinished project. And it does have upcoming features that I hope you'll also return to look at as well, such as a timeline, which will help to very visually chart the history and development of humanist thought and the impact of humanist action on the UK. And it also features a map to help plot geographically the impact. We don't have cathedrals and churches spread around, but we do have monuments and buildings and former homes all over the UK, which testify to the presence and the actions of humanists throughout history. And as I say, a big part of this whole project has been to highlight some of those forgotten stories, some of those forgotten individuals. And one aspect of this, a surprise to me, in fact, when I first started in this role, is the role of Wikimedian in Residence, which is also a title that I hold at Humanists UK. This isn't about editing or being paid to edit Wikipedia. Rather, it's about advocating for the values and the uses of Wikipedia. Whatever your opinion on Wikipedia, and we know, of course, that it does divide opinion, it is often the first port of call for people looking to research any subject, any person. It's usually the first Google search result, and it's often a great place to go to find out where information already exists about a subject or a person. And in many ways, the values of Wikipedia are very much aligned with humanism. It's an incredibly democratic resource, completely open to anyone to edit. It's about peer review, because people can correct, examine, remove people's edits if they're inappropriate or incorrect, and everything has to be sourced and backed up carefully with evidence. And all of this is very much in the spirit of humanism. And like humanists and humanism, it's also aware of its potential limitations, and that includes on Wikipedia significant biases in the material that's on there. Fewer than 20% of profiles, for example, on Wikipedia are women, and that's something that they're working very hard to address. Likewise, there are efforts in place to address the racial bias as well, in terms of representation and also the makeup of editors who is editing Wikipedia and what they're writing about. So one of the things we've been doing with the project, and one of our hopes for all of the material that has been taken from the archives and shared on the website, is that it will provide a rich bank of sources for people to use in helping to improve Wikipedia. Up here, in a, it has to be said, rather chaotic looking way, are some examples of pages that have been created in the course of this project of people of relevance to humanist history. May Seaton Tiedemann definitely deserves a reference. She was a prominent campaigner, a tireless campaigner for divorce law reform, in spite of her own very happy marriage, and largely overlooked because her fellows in the Divorce Law Reform Union were much more well known than her generally, including Arthur Conan Doyle. But Seton Tiedemann was really the driving force in passing some really significant legislation in divorce law reform. I've also got Austin Holyoake here, younger brother, lesser known Holyoake to George Jacob, who was very active in fighting for freedom of the press in particular, and secularism. Daisy Lucy Hobman, a founding member of the Brighton Humanist group, and a remarkable author and thinker as well. And Alma Haas, who is a good example of one of the very much lesser known individuals who was a member of the Ethical Society, and a musician, and a brilliant one, clearly. And just one of the names that have been pulled out of the membership lists of the Hampstead Ethical Institute and the West London Ethical Society, to give a flavour of who these humanists were, and what they were doing, and how they were being recognised or otherwise. We hope, now that we've got the project website up, that the possibilities for more Wikipedia work will be endless. We can keep adding and improving to Wikipedia, adding new pages for people currently underrepresented, improving the pages of people who aren't as well represented as they should be, and potentially adding material to Wikipedia source-wise that doesn't exist yet. I'm thinking perhaps things digitizable from the archives. I am going to hand over now, because I'll come back to talking about the archives after our next very much directly involved in humanist activism speaker, Diane Munday, who has been really a completely tireless campaigner for reproductive rights, a driving force in the Abortion Law Reform Association and the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, who I'm sure can speak much more eloquently to her motivations and to her successes than I can. So I will hand over now to Diane.
If you think rationally, which is what I like to think humanists do, it's really not at all surprising that those who do not believe in gods have been so prominent in the campaigns that have been influential in creating a society that certainly today is demonstrably more humane, more liberal than the one I was born into. And indeed, in the introduction, Keir Starmer mentioned some of those campaigns. In fact, so many of the irrational and evidence-defying beliefs and taboos that for centuries have influenced or determined aspects of humankind's laws and lives have directly given rise to an immeasurable and unnecessary amount of human suffering. And if we look back historically, a huge amount of this has sprung from the power, the uncritical respect accorded to the writings, preachings, decrees of prophets, gurus, and other religious leaders. And I think that needs to be spelled out, because it has been the starting point of so many humanist activists. I first rejected religion in the 1930s. It didn't become politically active until the 1960s. And since then, have found myself involved in a number of issues, which when I came to think about it in preparing this talk, most being involved, linked to matters of life and death, not to mention sex, subjects to which inexplicably, in my view, the religionists have until fairly recently managed to establish themselves as the experts, the arbiters, and indeed the controllers. Phrases such as sanctity of human life, only God gives life and so only God can take it away, and one I heard for the first time this week, sex is a gift from God, which I actually thought was good coming from the lips of a celibate Roman Catholic priest. Until recently, these have been accepted mainly uncritically. The humanist voices have not always been heard. And that brings me to the topic which I feel most strongly about and know most about, abortion. In fact, the campaign to make medical abortion legal and safe for all women who have needed to terminate an intolerable pregnancy, that campaign has dominated my life for more than 60 years. And humanists certainly played a pivotal part in the passing of the 1967 Abortion Act and the subsequent campaigns that have kept, with great difficulty, that law in place for more than half a century. Most people don't know that we have had to fight off more than 50 serious parliamentary attempts to destroy or restrict that pivotal act. The Abortion Law Reform Association was formed in the 1930s, again with a number of known non-believers active. It became moribund after the war when there were more respectable social ills to be dealt with, but was revived by the publicity surrounding the thalidomide tragedies in the 1950s. I indeed was offered that drug during my third pregnancy, but fortunately never took it. But the publicity about the horrors of the birth of over 10,000 congenitally severely handicapped children brought a great influx of new members like me to the Abortion Law Reform Association, who were non-believers and prepared to be outspoken and active in challenging the Church's traditional role of controlling women's reproductive lives. With a new chairman, a new committee, including, interestingly, 4 of its members to belonging to one of the then handful of humanist national organisations, I was a member of the Ethical Union at that time. And that new and invigorated committee started a campaign, and among the committee members playing pivotal roles in both putting and then keeping the word abortion, which previously happened but was never spoken or written about, well and truly in the public view. That was Madeline Sims and myself. Madeline was press secretary and newsletter editor, and I was elected vice chairman, never having sat on the committee for anything before that. My main role was speaking, debating, broadcasting to absolutely anybody who would listen. All the publicity around abortion at that time, and particularly a series of bills, all of which failed in Parliament in the early 60s, sparked the largely religious opposition to get itself organised. Interestingly, I think, their tactics in the beginning were truthful. They, for instance, described themselves as anti-abortion. But then they learned that in fact this carried little or no weight, with much of the public, nearly half of whom were in a position to become pregnant, and had also themselves had an abortion, an illegal one, or knew somebody who had. And with the religious anti-abortion stance being at the core of their campaign, they soon learned that it didn't carry any weight, and hence the description pro-life was coined. And still, regrettably to me, particularly by the broadcasting media, is still almost universally used, which of course puts people who think like I do as in the anti-life camp, which is not true. Religious-based arguments proposing the deliberate ending of pregnancies provided, and I was almost going to say God-given, but probably that's not the correct phrase, but provided endless opportunities for supporters like Madeline and me to present a rational and fact-based case that I like to think has contributed to the development of the contrived and readily shown to be untrue women's welfare-centred case against abortion. That is the one we always hear today. But whether in their literature, in the press, or indeed in Parliament, completely fictitious, secular rather than religious so-called facts are now always used to boost the anti-abortion case. Examples are legal abortion is a dangerous procedure, quoted in Parliament during recent 10-minute bills on the subject, that it causes sterility or cancer in the leaflets handed out to people demonstrating outside abortion clinics. It's bad for mental health because deep down, every woman knows she is murdering her child. I had that argument thrown at me, accounting for my peculiar stance on abortion. It causes delayed depression and breakdown in later life, caused by suppressed guilt. These are the arguments over and over again now used, and demonstrably are not true, with 1 in 3 women in Britain having had, or younger ones likely to have had an abortion. We just do not have that large pool in the population of people suffering because they have had an abortion. Most recently, in the current campaign to keep telemedicine legal after the end of the pandemic, opponents have resorted to direct lies, claiming very recently, in fact, and publicised in one of the major daily newspapers, that 2 women who were at home for each stage of the medical procedure to end their pregnancy had actually died as a result. It took a freedom of information request to get the truth that no woman had died from an abortion performed in her own home. And so I think it will go on. Given more time, I could give numerous examples of the input and practical impact non-believers have made by speaking out and challenging religious fairy tales, religious myths, religious lies, and dogma. all now can be counted with hands. The longer abortion has been legal, and it is 53 years since the 67 Act was passed, sometimes it seems more real to me than what happened yesterday, the lies and the dogma continue. So I'd like to finish in campaigning mood, which is my usual one, saying that now legal abortion is under threat, probably as much as it, or more than it has ever been in many parts of the world, that I hope my contribution tonight will have inspired some people who are watching and living, inspired, encouraged them to go out when they hear the lies and counter them, so women in the future can continue to benefit from the ability and the knowledge they have the ability to control their own fertility. Thank you.
Hello, it's me again. Thank you so much, Diane. What you said there also very much made me think of Stella Brown standing before the 1937 Burkitt Committee on Abortion and saying, if abortion were necessarily fatal or injurious, I would not be standing here before you today. And it's people, it's humanists like Stella Brown, like Madeline Sims, like Diane Munday, who have been bold enough to stand up and to bring about enormous change. And as Diane says, it's now our responsibility to make sure that we don't backslide and that we continue to fight for those things that we as humanists believe in. I'm just going to very quickly mention the role of the archives in this project. So I would just like to say that the Bishopsgate has a wonderful collection, a radical collection, full of material about reform, about free thought, humanism, about trade unionism, about LGBTQ activism, about press freedom, anti-censorship, everything you can think of is there, and it's a brilliantly accessible archive and a very, very helpful staff. And of course, it's home to the British Humanist Association archive, our archive, as well as the Rationalist Press Association archive. So please do, when we're able, which I believe is from the 17th of May, go and check it out. I wanted to mention, and I think Diane Munday and David Pollock after me will very much testify, or well, are living embodiments, in fact, of the notion that although archives can tell us so much, and they have been the grounding of this project, there's also no replacing human memory and human experience and talking to people. In the course of this project, people have come to me, either emailed me or got in touch in various ways to offer material that I wouldn't have otherwise been aware of, and to offer memories as well. For example, Derek of what was the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association and is now LGBT Humanists, was excellently helpful in telling me lots of the things that the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association did that haven't necessarily made their presence known in the archives. For example, helping to coordinate the UK activities of Idaho, the International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia, which in fact is in May too. And as a community of support and fun as well, which also doesn't always come out in the archives, as well as, of course, relentlessly challenging oppression, legal and in the attitudes of society and others. The collections of individual humanist groups as well, and I'm sure there are lots of people watching who are members of such groups who may well be aware of material that's held in people's homes, in personal collections that would be marvellously interesting to know about. Somebody from the Brighton Humanist group shared some of their past materials with me, and that was incredibly informative for me in knowing about what those individual humanist groups regionally around the UK were doing at the same time as part of the overall effort of the British Humanist Association, as it then was. And I also recently got an email from somebody who uncovered in her home the notebook of her grandfather, which recorded the meetings of the Ipswich heretics in the 30s and 40s. And among its active members was a Mary Whitmore, who was Ipswich's first woman mayor. And this is the kind of thing, again, that aren't necessarily in the major archives, be it the Bishopsgate or the Working Class Movement Library, the People's History Museum, the Cooperative Archives, any number, Conway Hall, of course, another remarkable resource. But there will undoubtedly be lots of you and lots of people in general who have collections, who have reminiscences about humanist activism. And this is just a small plea that if that is the case, I would love to hear from you. As I say, the website will be a perpetually growing resource, and I hope to continuously add to it to represent as well as we can the very vibrant and lived history of humanist activism, especially in the past few decades. And ongoing, of course. And talking about remarkable personal archives, I will hand over to David Pollock now. David Pollock's enormous and incredibly well documented archive has been hugely helpful to me in this, as has his recollections and the thoughts, ideas, input he shared with me. David Pollock was very active in the British Humanist Association during the 90s and 60s. He had also previously been an active member of the Oxford University Humanist group and created a brilliant website holding some of their archive material online. He's a former chair of the British Humanist Association and was a trustee of Humanists UK from 1965 to 75 and again since 1997. He was also president of the European Humanist Federation and received Humanist International's Distinguished Service to Humanism Award in 2011. So you can see from that, I hope, what a treat you're in for.
Thank you, Madeline. Yes, I'm now in my 60th year of active humanism. I'm going to talk about the humanists in the 1960s, basically, but I'm going to start rather earlier. In 1933, Harold Blackham succeeded Stanton Coet as the minister at the Ethical Church in Bayswater, where Pallas Athene, goddess of wisdom, presided over all. But Blackham was progressively developing the philosophy of humanism, and in 1953, he sold the Ethical Church and bought 13 Prince of Wales Terrace in Kensington, which was our abode until the early 1990s. Pallas Athene moved from the church to a niche on the first floor landing. Opposite was a niche with a funerary urn containing the ashes of, I believe, Stanton Coet himself. It looks grand, but the Ethical Union, our name then, used only 2 floors and had a staff of only 3 or 4. Then, and until the 1990s, we worked very largely through volunteers in subcommittees responsible for particular fields. I came on the scene, as you heard, from Oxford, where Tony Brierley had started the Oxford University Humanist Group in 1958. I have put its extensive archives, as Maddie said, online at ouhg.org.uk. During the early 1960s, when I was up, it was a flourishing group. Membership reached 1,200, and huge meetings heard big name speakers. It got much attention in the press and was even mentioned at the World Council of Churches in Geneva. While this was happening, in 1963, the Ethical Union and the Rationalist Press Association, now a Rationalist Association, created an umbrella organisation, which they called the British Humanist Association, a compromise arrangement, as both wanted the name Humanist, but they could not then or later negotiate a merger. But in 1965, just 2 years later, an irate Kensington ratepayer complained that the EU should not be a charity getting rates relief out of his pocket. The authorities agreed. The EU was not educational, but propagandist, and they struck us off the register. As joint BHA's objects included those of the EU, the RPA quickly pulled out in a vain attempt to safeguard its own charitable status. Soon afterwards, all the humanist organisations were struck off. The unsatisfactory BHA, the joint BHA, collapsed, and in 1967, the EU changed its name to British Humanist Association and gave up on its hard-fought attempt to regain charity status. As a charity, we had been unable to undertake any political activity, and the rules were then both tighter and more obscure than now. But with Harold Wilson as PM and Roy Jenkins as Home Secretary, many of us wanted to fight for the law reforms that were beginning to look possible, not just abortion, as you've heard, but also homosexuality, theatre censorship, family planning on the NHS, and much, much more. In 1965, therefore, I created Humanist Lobby as an independent organisation with a separate membership to get round this ban on political activity. This and the next slide show the topics of the first few circulars up to the end of 1966. The circulars kept members in touch with what was going on in Parliament and urged them to write to their MPs. I ran the lobby from home, and a subscription of £0.5, 12.5 pence, was enough to cover the costs. In 1967, when the charity battle was definitively lost, Humanist Lobby was merged with the BHA, but it continued to be run in much the same way. I kept in touch with the various law reform organisations, liaised with friendly members of Parliament, assiduously read the newspapers, which then provided much better parliamentary coverage than now, and had standing orders with the Stationery Office for everything on relevant bills in Parliament. The lobby asked members to send us the replies they got from MPs so that we could build up files on friends and identify foes. As it grew, the BHA employed a part-time clerk to help with the filing and to type letters from tapes that I sent her. All this naturally led to the creation of a humanist parliamentary group, which was jointly sponsored with the National Secular Society, although all the work was done by the BHA. Key members included Peter Jackson, whom you can see here, who is still active on his local sacre, though he lost his seat in 1970. He was the secretary of the group and chivied other MPs to join. Its chair was Dr. David Kerr, and here are some of its other members. We sent them briefs and pressed them to take part in debates. We invited them to dinners where they heard speakers, including celebrities of the day, such as A.J. Ayer, James Hemming, and Edmund Leach. The background to all this was the development, by Harold Blackham in particular, of the notion of the open society, the idea that it was unrealistic to hope for everyone to be humanists and that society ought to have liberal ground rules that allowed for people of all manner of beliefs and opinions to live together. We were alone, I think, in proclaiming as part of our own beliefs that it was right and proper for others to disagree with us, and that our belief system, humanism, provided a framework for us all to get on with each other. We heavily promoted the open society idea with 2 major articles which I wrote for Humanist News, regional meetings where the executive committee went on tour to meet local humanist groups and members, and a 2-day seminar the Royal Festival Hall, not, I hasten to add, in the main auditorium, at which we had speakers including Bernard Crick, Tony Benn, Edward Boyle, and Joe Grimmond. Later, the proceedings of the seminar were published by the RPA as a book. There is much more that I have no time for, but one particular campaign in the 1970s is worth mentioning, as it arose from our own problems with charity law. We set up an independent campaign under the name Charity Law Reform Committee, with members drawn from other organisations as well as from BHA. It gathered a great deal of attention, but sadly it got nowhere. My time's running out, and so though did the vigour of our campaigning. By the early 1970s, all the key reforms seemed to be complete, and we had a change. We'd had a change of government, and we were having to defend, as you heard, particularly with abortion, what we had already achieved against persistent attacks. I think it's fair to say that a measure of complacency set in, and from the later 1970s until the 1990s, the BHA went into a sad period of decline. And so that brings my remarks to an end, and no doubt we'll hear more about the more recent times. Thank you.
Yes, I think otherwise that would be a very sad point at which to end. I'm going to remove my my logo there, which is started to flicker, and go to this green screen. Of course, history didn't end in the mid-20th century, and although Humanist UK, British Humanist Association as it then was, fell into, as many organisations seeking progressive change did in the 70s, 80s and early 90s, something of a torpor. Since then, of course, we've been reinvigorated, and we've been reinvigorated, I think, by a range of factors. One is obviously the growing strength, in spite of declining numbers, of religious lobby groups and religious arguments in the public sphere. And as we've heard, although humanist organisations and humanists have always had our own independent convictions, our own self-sufficient beliefs and values, it's also been the case that our voices have been required in public campaigns, most necessary when religious groups have been arguing for causes contrary to humanist aspirations for society. And so a resurgence in political religion in the last few years has undoubtedly contributed to a similar resurgence in humanist activism and in humanist concerns. And then there's the demographic factor. The growing surge now in non-religious beliefs and non-religious identities in the UK, certainly across the UK, in every part of the UK, has contributed to the increase in popularity of humanist ideas and of the community services that Humanist UK provides. We know now, and we heard from the First Minister of Scotland about the great work of Humanist Society in Scotland, but we know now that in Scotland there are more humanist marriages, legal humanist marriages, than any other belief-based type of marriage. Humanist funerals now all across the UK are of huge importance. So our reach has been expanded by the growing demographic weight of the non-religious. And people in Britain, just as in the 1890s, when our founders said that one of their efforts was to construct a theory of what is right, starting with the reality of moral distinctions and connect these ideas in a logical system of thought. That was one of the first objects of the ethical union. Just then, now as then, people are seeking coherent beliefs, coherent values with which to confront not only the challenges of their own personal lives, but the big issues of today. And the humanist approach to life is one that for non-religious people provides that way of looking at things, provides the resources that are needed, drawing, as we've been hearing, on a long tradition throughout time, and certainly in this country, but throughout the world, helps to provide the beginnings of those answers for the difficult, hard problems of today. So all of that makes me think, by the way, that our future is rosy, just as our last couple of decades have been as an organisation. But what I think this project, Humanist Heritage, should do is put back on the map, put back in the forefront of the stories that we tell about the 20th century, the roles of humanist organisations and of humanists in that time. The great humanist Hector Horton wrote a book in the mid-20th century called The Humanist Revolution, in which he described the change that had come about in the world of ideas, in politics, in social attitudes, all or mostly driven by this new recognition, as Diane was telling us, she experienced in her own youth, this new recognition that human beings had it in themselves to make a better world, and that if change was going to come, it had to come in this one life that we're living now. All of those factors have been prominent in the 20th century history of Britain, from the introduction of the National Health Service to the foundation of great NGOs like Liberty or international organisations like UNESCO, all of which were led by British humanists. The creation of the Open University, as we've heard, led by British humanists, and so much of what makes the modern world. That's the history that we're putting back on the map. And I'm delighted now to be rejoined by Maddie to have some questions and some discussion from the audience under those themes. And we've already got a couple of questions here, Maddie. So I'll ask the first one here, and it's a question from an audience member, Catherine, who said she was interested in the first 10 minutes of your talk. You focused almost exclusively on women proponents of humanism. Is this mainly because you were trying to redress the balance, because women are often written out of history, or for some other reason? And just before you answer that, I'm going to invite all the audience that are present to ask your questions in the question box that you can probably see. I can't, because I can only see the box where we answer them, but probably if you're watching this, you do have a question box that you can type your question into, and please do that, because we're very keen to hear some questions. But Maddie, let's take this one first, women, and this is something that you and I have spoken about before, and it's a very interesting topic, I think.
It is a very interesting topic, and clearly my slight bias for the women activists shows. It really is. It's partly, as Catherine quite rightly says, about redressing the balance. Women have largely been deliberately or otherwise written out of the history of free thought more broadly, and also organised humanism as well. And it was something that really struck me in the archives. Not only people like Zona Valence, the first chief executive, also Lily Boileau, a very active suffragist, Florence Winterbottom, correspondent of Gandhi, and again a secretary of the Union of Ethical Societies for many years, Nellie Freeman, Bessie Mabbs. The list really goes on, and when you count up the membership of those early ethical societies, the ones that we do have good membership records for, it is often over 50% women, which was something that really did strike me. And I think it's something that is particularly interesting as well about the early ethical movement, which, as I mentioned at the start, I think gave everyone, not just women, but perhaps women in particular, a kind of slightly more, at that time, socially acceptable way of expressing dissent from traditional Christian ideals, and showing that they were still, moral and interested in changing the world.
Well, I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it did do that for everyone, obviously, and you're right. We see that, don't we? That the congregational aspect almost of the early humanist movement, which is still a feature of it in some places like the US or in Germany, they still have those sort of humanist almost congregations. But the congregation aspect was obviously a socially acceptable and ethically focused way of doing it. But I wondered if also for women, there was something quite exciting. I mean, there is a predominance of women actually on things like the committees and some of the membership lists quite often, and not just during the First World War and the Second World War. We'd expect women to be more prominent because there are fewer men around, but all through sort of the late 19th and late 20th century, there's a lot of women, a lot more than you'd expect. And I wondered if one of the reasons for that was that early humanist movement allowed women to do something which was seen as a sort of woman's role, be on a committee of a church type organization. But at the same time, it was much more exciting that because it also allowed them to do a lot of external facing political activism. I mean, these women aren't arranging the flowers and keeping the minutes, they're out fighting on the streets, well, not physically, but campaigning on the streets as much as anything else. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really a very valid and interesting take on it, and it probably is the case. As you say, there were still fairly restricted roles and fairly set expectations for what women might be able to do, and so in lots of those organisational roles, which were key to the running and the popularising as well of the movement, you did see women in those, and as you say, not just taking the minutes, making the tea, but really working for change. So people like, as I mentioned, May Seton Tiedemann, she wasn't just, although she was a kind of organizer and a committee member of the Union of Ethical Societies, she was also in Hyde Park every weekend campaigning for divorce law reform and holding up a sandwich board and everything that goes with that. So I think, I think that's a really interesting.
We've got lots of good questions, but before we leave women, one last thing about women. I think that one of the interesting jobs that you've had to do is excavate a lot of women who had literally been forgotten. And of course, women are routinely forgotten in the history of everything. And so that's just a normal part of history. You often have to excavate the female cast of lots of stories. But I think we found a particular problem, didn't we, in that there is something quite specific about, and I like this phrase that's coined almost like whitewashing, this Christ washing, this women's agency in their obituaries and their biographies, where they'd chosen humanist values, was almost taken away from them. And they instead of their lives and their chosen morality being mentioned, you get these weasel words like raised a devout Quaker, or her parents were very Catholic, and their humanism, their ethical convictions completely written out of the story. Why is that? Is that back in your domestic box, woman, or
I think I think that's a part of it. I think there's sometimes assumptions there based on of course, writers of said biographies who maybe assume, whether it's because of their own belief system or otherwise, that the person they're writing the biography about had much the same ideas as they do, or motivations. And as you say, I think sometimes it's just not, or often possibly, it's just not mentioned at all. As you say, they'll talk about a Quaker upbringing, or or even their funerals, which sometimes had nothing to do with what they might have.
Of course, that's quite common, isn't it?
So reading between the lines sometimes, and which is something that, as I say, this project has allowed us to do, to see, well, actually, no, this person was writing this thing. They were actively involved in this organisation. These things that show, even when other biographies of them either don't mention their kind of belief system at all, or suggest that it is a Christian or otherwise religiously motivated one, kind of allows us to challenge it, really, and to fill in those gaps about where that's coming from.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions here, and I think let's try and get through them all, because people like to feel they've been satisfied. I'll take this first one. Einstein is on the website, says an anonymous attendee. Einstein's on the website. Was Einstein very involved in humanism? Well, if you've seen him on the website, you can read the page, but where he's involved in his profile. But in a word, yes, that's right, isn't it, Madeline? He was, when he was in the UK, he was a member of the Rationalist Association. When he migrated to the US, he was a member and a committee member, I think, of the New York Humanist Society, a very committed humanist involved in ethical culture and rationalism and humanist organizations by name. So I think we can deal with that one quite quickly. In fact, the magazine that became New Humanist, What's Literary, was on his desk when he died, wasn't it? There's a famous photograph of Einstein's desk on the day he died, and there's what a few years later would be New Humanist, the magazine that changed its name to New Humanist. Okay, here's one for you, Maddie. Do you think, we're going to make short fire answers. I'm not very good at that, but you'll have to set me a good example. Maddie, do you think, asks Marty, do you think the 1896 start makes the Ethical Union, British Humanist Association, the first humanist organisation worldwide? Oh, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, if you consider, as I say, our organised movement arose out of the ethical movement, which itself was born of the ethical culture movement, which was Felix Adler's in the US. And the US still has an ethical culture movement and a humanist movement. And although they've both been involved in things like, you know, International Humanist and Ethical Union, which is Humanist International today, there is a kind of twin tradition. So I suppose it depends if you're talking, you know, kind of by what name, whether we're talking about something defined as humanist from the start or otherwise. But certainly,
I mean, Germany has some very old organisations that I think the oldest member organisation of Humanist International, I think, is German. It's like an 18th century organisation, you know.
Yeah. So, I think there are long traditions.
I've got lots of questions here that aren't about the content of this evening, so I'm afraid I'm just going to dismiss those. Unfortunately, we're going to keep to the history because that's what this event is about. But there's plenty more Humanist UK events happening throughout the year that you can come and ask these other questions. David Warden has an interesting question. Could we say a little bit more about why the British Humanist Association went into decline in the 70s and 80s? And actually, we've both just been reading, or have you been reading, I don't know, an early draft of a book about the history of the BHA from 1896 to 2021. And coincidentally, David Warden, who's asking this question, I just read this chapter yesterday, the early draft from the historian who's writing it yesterday. Maddie, have you read that yet?
I have not, so you take this one.
Well, it seemed really to be, it's a combination of factors, or at least these three historians who are writing this book think it is, and they've done some oral history as well as some archival research. But as David Pollock was saying at the end of his talk, really there was a strong sense on the one hand of sort of, you know, battles won, tide turned, you know, human choice and human freedom and human autonomy, and the sort of equality and human rights based approach that humanists wanted to see had you know, been successful in homosexual law reform, in divorce law reform, in abortion law reform. So there were people who felt sort of job done. And then I think that these historians at least thought that BHA fell victim to the same factors that a lot of other progressive causes fell down to, which was the very inhospitable environment of Thatcherism, in particular in the 1980s. But I suggest you read this forthcoming, I think it's going to be published sometime next year, history of the BHA to find out more. I think there were also some personalities involved, but you know, some of those people are still alive, so you don't want to get too analytical about that, and for a safe few decades. Hester asks, Maddie, what headings do you put this humanist history under? For instance, you've mentioned the history of free thought. You know, is there a history of worldviews or world philosophies, or do historians think of non-religion or non-conformism, or what? Interesting question, actually, because this is in a way a new field of history.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I often think or talk in terms of free thought because it's a very all-encompassing word that kind of captures essentially the humanist tradition of thinking for yourself and following that and your conscience where it leads. But I think worldviews, certainly, to take Harry Stopes-Rowe's life stance as well, although I don't necessarily use those kind of broadly on the website. I think, yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of different words, isn't there? I sometimes talk about unbelief and belief as well, but I know that can sometimes be, you know,
like unbelief.
They're saying, yeah, unbelief suggests
very negative,
don't believe in anything at all, which we know isn't true. Yeah, I think that is a good question. I think, like I say, I've ended up tending towards free thought as a kind of all-encompassing view. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, obviously, you know, I'm personally and professionally committed to the brand of humanist for all of this stuff, and I don't think it's anachronistic. I think that the word humanist is an analytical word. I mean, just as the word free thought is. You know, you're never going to find a category that is a self-identity throughout time of everyone that you want to talk about, everyone that share these particular beliefs and values. And so I think that I think I'd like to see a new field of humanist history, of the history of humanism. But I think the actual answer to Hester's question is that no, there isn't a particular field at the moment. I think probably academically this would fit into social and cultural history.
Can I just
guess, please?
I was just thinking, this is slightly kind of shifting on to another question that I saw from John.
If you see it, you can answer it. Is this John? John Dowdall?
Dowdall, yeah.
Yeah, so, go on, cooperative movement.
Yeah, which is really interesting because I have consciously, certainly on the website, deliberately included cooperative movement and the
people can't see his question, so you'll have to say what it is.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So John says, I'm surprised that no mention has been made of the cooperative movement dating from Rochdale in 1844. Is there no connections between that movement and the growth of humanist and secular values? Owen and Holyoake were early cooperators. Some of the early Fabians too also cooperated, such as Annie Besant, through some of her, though some of her later ideas were strange. Agreed.
Less said about the better.
Absolutely is the answer to that. There is a huge crossover in tradition and a direct kind of line as well. One obvious part of that would be Emily Holyoake, George Jacob Holyoake's daughter, who continued his secularist and trade unionist and cooperative legacy, and was also active all her life in the ethical movement and the early humanist movement. And as you say, the Rochdale pioneers, the museum in Rochdale is on the website, as are people like Holyoake and Besant, and likewise the cooperative archives, which contain lots of relevance, and also secular ceremonies and the pursuit of rational religion, which was very
of course the first naming ceremony, which we tweeted about today, Holyoake's naming of the Mazzini child.
Yeah, which is one of my favourite documents I've come across, actually, that the story of George Jacob Holyoake naming Edward Truelove's son in a secular naming ceremony, very much in the cooperative movement, and it was essentially a precursor of today's humanist ceremonies. What they were saying was, we need a ceremony that fits with what we believe.
Content of that ceremony, actually, which we posted about today on our Twitter, was strikingly similar to today's humanist naming ceremonies. It was, about the name and about the character and so on. Here's a question. I noticed there are lots of Indian and Black humanists on the Humanist Heritage site. It's great to see their contributions reflected in the history of the movement. You talked about the outsized role of women in the early humanist movement. Was there any unique history of racial equality activism within the humanist movement? This is actually something else we have drawn attention to, I think.
Yeah, and certainly tried to, and again have actively tried to pull it out of the archives, where again it might be a history that's overlooked. Potentially. So we've talked about and recently highlighted the work of humanists and those early ethical movement members in bringing about the Universal Races Congress in 1911, which was the first global anti-racist congress. It brought people from all over the world to try and improve relations between countries and between races. And challenge some of the, particularly the kind of pseudo-scientific arguments for racial difference that were floating around at the time, and indeed very prevalent at the time. And so it was a remarkable thing, and people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who himself had very humanist values, was really touched all the way through his life about the efforts of that, which was largely the work of Gustav Spiller and Felix Adler of the ethical movement as an organisation, but helped with an enormous committee of people from across the world.
From a wide range of
and also the other thing which I would just mention is that although it's not to say that no atheists have ever held racist views, sadly we can't argue that, but lots of or there is a strong tradition of free thought among for example African Americans, because of the historic intertwining between Christianity and the sanction of slavery. So again, these kind of traditions are being drawn out, and there's some really amazing scholarship about it.
There's a really good book by Nathan Alexander, Race in a Godless World, about
Exactly,
19th century non-religious people and racism. So Nathan Alexander. There's actually a bit of a question here that links to that as well, which is, how did you deal with people from history, of those who've made contributions to humanist thought, but also held views that are very obviously anti-humanist, like white supremacy or racism? Or we actually thought about this quite seriously, didn't we?
Yeah, we did, because it's not very humanist to ignore those things or pretend that people didn't hold those views, which were often quite contradictory with some of the other things that they believed or did. So we did decide that it is necessary to confront those where they are, and it's an ongoing plan as well, as part of the website, to have articles, for example, which will deal more specifically with aspects of that. For example, some of those really quite prominent figures in the development of humanism here and on an international level, who did hold views or investigate ideas such as eugenics and comparable theories, which of course we disavow today. So yeah, it was it presents a challenge to us, but I think it's it's the correct, both historically and humanist approach, to be honest about it, and to examine it properly.
There's a good statement on the website about that, which I'd recommend to anyone who is interested. I'm trying to weed out the questions that aren't really historical, but are people having an opportunity to ask another question. Other questions are fine in other contexts, but we're focusing here on history. I think we've got time for two more. Keir Starmer, Ed Davey, both talked in their remarks about Labour humanists and Liberal humanists. Are there as many humanists in the other political traditions, Conservative or Nationalist or Scottish Nationalist or whatever else? This is an interesting question, because of course there are in history humanists in the history of our organisation. I mean, not just the history of humanism, of every political creed.
Yep, there are.
Famous conservatives that you uncovered?
Oh,
there are some.
Yeah, there are, and I think that is important to know. I know, and it's interesting because we've talked about things like the struggles in the 60s and 70s, for example, or 70s and onwards, that often it was difficult, for example, with the first parliamentary humanist group, to get a fully representative, properly all-party group together, because it did end up often being quite heavily Labour and Liberal. But that's not to say that there aren't any Conservatives or varying other.
I suppose historically there is that strong association between conservative politics and the established church, and that's a sort of that is a genuine political link at times in history. But if you think of prominent conservative philosophers like Anthony Flew, or today people who are MPs, the current chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Humanist Group is a Conservative MP, Crispin Blunt. Famous politicians like, for example, Tristan Gowell-Jones, Lord Gowell-Jones, who was Thatcher's Europe minister, who was a Humanist UK patron. But I think it's true to say that when they've become involved politically, humanists have tended to parties that have been deliberately progressive rather than in relation to conservative politics. And of course, that makes sense because often humanists are seeking change. And so that is natural. How long, this will be our penultimate question, how long has assisted dying been a policy for the humanists? I don't know if that's come up in your research yet, but certainly it was a discussion as early as the 1930s, I know, from Humanist UK archive. Have you looked into it?
Yeah, it's certainly they were
euthanasia they were talked about.
Yeah, exactly, and making links with groups that supported it, and also as we know, there were individuals of humanist persuasion who were writing and advocating for assisted dying early on. There's been a long history with the organised movement for assisted dying as well, right from the early stages. In fact, I was just looking at that the other day, so I should be able to answer this more eloquently.
It's an ongoing project, isn't it?
It is, yeah. But there, as I say, there has been a long and very closely intertwined history, and lots of, in fact, the MPs that at various stages have attempted to pass legislation have been humanists. So it's it goes back a long
Here's
way.
a last question then, and because we're very close to, in fact, we're beyond the time when we should have finished here, but it's so many good questions we couldn't have abandoned them before now. A last question, and a big one. To what extent do you think, this is Robert Ashby, I don't know whether this is our former chair, Robert Ashby, or our former chief executive, Robert Ashby, or another Robert Ashby, we have so many Robert Ashbys. To what extent do you think that difficult choices about which social issues humanists choose to campaign about over the years are influenced by those that are best addressed by fundamental humanist principles, or were they personally driven, or were they just the most current ones at a particular time? How did humanists over the last 125 years choose which issues to be active on, what campaigns to have?
Oh, that is I'm just going to reread that question.
I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you look at the campaigns for free school meals, campaigns for universal education, campaigns against worship in education from the early 20th century, in particular campaigns for secular education. And it's a bit like another question that was asked here, but we didn't get to either, which is, over time there's been, as an organisation, we've sometimes had very wide campaigns that are about society, like homosexual law reform or divorce law reform. And then we've had often quite narrow campaigns that are about the treatment of, not narrow, but as it more self-interest, I suppose, treatments about, campaigns about the treatment of non-religious people in particular.
I think, so I think that, as it says there, in terms of utilising what we would regard as fundamental human principles, I think that does come into a lot of decisions about campaigning. So, in terms of wanting equality, in wanting a society that equips people to be able to live the best and most full life they can, and that comes out in all sorts of areas, particularly where there are visible inequalities or visible injustices happening, as you say, everything from school meals to legal injustices like laws regarding homosexuality, laws regarding blasphemy, and those things that are fundamentally related to what we believe to be human rights, and which are human rights, and also there are, I think, some. So personally driven, for example, might be something like, where humanists have become involved in, say, the agnostic adoption society. Somebody comes to them and says,
with a problem,
I've had we've got a problem. This is really clearly a
and that's
problem.
still how we work now. Sometimes we start campaigns because someone comes with a problem. Yeah,
exactly. And because perhaps they approach the Humanist Association either because they're a member or because they recognise that those values are likely to lead to wanting to challenge that injustice. So I think it's a mix. I mean, there are certain things that have been very much a part of Humanist UK campaigning from the very beginning. So things regarding education particularly, because it is central to the values of humanism that you're giving people, children included, the chance to make up their own minds, to be able to access the schools they should, to learn in the way that they should. And so things like moral education, as it began, have been consistently an area of campaigning throughout. And then, as I say, sometimes it comes from other things. So
very good. I'm told by the office here that someone sent me a message to say there was a founder of the SNP who was a humanist, Cunningham Graham. That's a fine SNP name, Cunningham Graham. That sounds like it should be in the SNP, that's your name. Cunningham Graham, there you go. So we're across all the political parties.
I'll write that down.
Take a note of that. Take that down. Exactly.
It's quite a memorable name, but I'll note it down anyway.
Oh, no. Madeline, thank you so much. Your work has been so impressive, and we're all so proud of it and so interested in it because it's so productive and fascinating. And of course, everyone likes reading about themselves and their predecessors. And so we've all enjoyed reading about Humanist UK and learning more. Thank you very much to all our other guests this evening, to David Pollock and Diane Munday for sharing their experiences. I'm sorry that we couldn't hear from them again at the end, but I know that there'll be other events throughout this year, and that our anniversary year, our 125th anniversary year, will be one that we continue to celebrate. If you haven't yet, out there in the audience, been to Madeline's incredible website, Humanist Heritage, please do. And other than that, thank you for coming this evening. Enjoy your evening, enjoy your weekend. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.